In this video, I want to first talk about the domains of giftedness, which we've mentioned briefly before, and then I want to talk about sort of ideal and potential gifted services and how those might look like in different school settings. So, as we mentioned, giftedness can be found in many different ways. One is the traditional definition, which focuses on intellectual giftedness. And I'm kind of calling here that academic giftedness. Those are actually two different but related things. Creative giftedness, that could be giftedness in terms of the arts. It could also be giftedness in terms of creative thought, including sometimes engineering and things like that. Leadership. Leadership is a newer category of giftedness. It really relates to really an increased academic and school interest, K-12 and in college, of leadership studies that has occurred over the past few decades. And then I should mention talents. You'll often hear gifted referred to as gifted and talented. And some of you who come from other states may have heard things like GATE, gifted and talented education, or TAG, talented and gifted. Gifted textbooks actually spend pages trying to explain the difference between gifts and talents. And I'm not going to do that. I don't know that there really is a clear-cut, consistent definition that everyone agrees on. Some people tend to think of talents as being more creative, like being artistic or musical or dramatic, whereas gifts are more intellectual, but that is not a widespread view necessarily. So gifted and talented, the difference between a gift and a talent is not clearly defined. We've talked about etiology, what causes giftedness before. I just want to point out again, there is a genetic component, but genetics are never destiny. There's also an environmental component. So that's the nature versus nurture debate. So let's talk about giftedness in a school setting. What's appropriate for gifted students? The number one most appropriate thing is acceleration. And let me say that again for the people in the back. The number one most appropriate thing for gifted students is acceleration. We'll talk more about acceleration in a bit. And I want you to know that when you hear acceleration, I bet that some people listening to this have concerns, and those concerns are not borne out by the research. Now, something that is less controversial than acceleration, and also less effective but better than nothing, is what's called compaction or curriculum compaction, which we'll also talk about. Another issue is testing out. So I spent most of my teaching career in Kansas, where gifted is part of special education, is required K-12. And when I was in Kansas, the Kansas education requirements actually stated that gifted students were allowed to test out of a course or a unit of study. And so that meant that theoretically, a gifted child in high school could test out of, say, Algebra 2, or could test out of U.S. history, or whatever it might be. And then independent study. Independent study is also often part of a compaction model. In this approach, the child is responsible more for their own learning, with or without teacher guidance, depending on sort of the age of the child and how comfortable they are with independent study. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. There's a couple of common sort of pre-made models out there. These aren't pre-packaged like things to buy necessarily. They're designed by different sort of experts in the field. And I see them kind of similar to each other, even though if you looked at them closely, there's differences. One is called the autonomous learner model, and this is often used more in the secondary level, if I'm remembering correctly. And this focuses on explorations of what it means to be gifted. In this model, there's often a gifted seminar where students take as an elective class. Students learn about their own strengths and weaknesses, because the other thing about gifted, as we mentioned, that you could be gifted in one or several areas, but you also, as a gifted learner, may have, or certainly have, some weaknesses. Those might be relative weaknesses, or they might be, weaknesses that would be considered weaknesses for anybody. And again, self-directed or independent study of areas of interest. The school-wide enrichment model is very similar, is similar in some ways to the autonomous learner model. It tends to be more at the elementary level, but it could be used at other levels. It predates the current tier system that you may be familiar with as part of what's sometimes called multi-tier system of supports and sometimes called response to instruction or response to intervention, but it very much fits into that model. And the school-wide enrichment model, type 1 or tier 1, is exposure to different types of enrichment activities. These are activities that go beyond the curriculum. They may not be directly included in the curriculum, or they may be expanding on something in the curriculum. And all students get exposure to these activities, perhaps through school-wide assemblies. Sometimes that exposure is used as part of gifted identification. And then type 2 or tier 2 is working on those enrichment areas, that exposure area, whatever it might be. Students engage in critical and creative thinking and problem solving around those. Sometimes it's a problem-based learning environment. And that would be for a few students. Students who had sort of indicated through the exposure activities that they were both willing, they're sort of willing, ready, and able to go on to the next level. And then type 3 or tier 3 is self-directed study, and this is typically only a few students. These models are not super widespread. They certainly aren't widespread in Minnesota, but as RTI has taken more root in more schools, increasingly schools that are a little more concerned with gifted learners are recognizing that the tiers of RTI, and we'll talk about those tiers in a couple weeks, are also appropriate for not just remediation or kids who need extra help, but also for kids who need extra challenge. In terms of measuring the progress of gifted students, and this is also sometimes part of the identification process, we want to look at both product and process. So the product should be a way for us to look at what skills the student used. It's a way for us to identify ourselves, how thoroughly we taught things. But we also want our students to be self-monitoring, to develop those self-monitoring skills while they're working. There's actually been some recent research I was just reading about self-monitoring, that gifted students don't do it very well. Neither do students in general. And it's partially for gifted students, probably because they haven't had complex enough projects that have required them to use it. Process is what processes the children or adolescents go through, what sorts of problem solving and critical thinking are involved. So we're looking at both these, not just product, but both the final product and how kids got there. So let's talk about where gifted students are placed. As with other types of special education, in districts where gifted is actually appreciated, there is typically a continuum of services. I mentioned last week when we talked about kids who are deaf and hard of hearing that for many people in deaf culture, the least restrictive environment is not believed to be the regular classroom because there are communication challenges when deaf students are placed with non-deaf students, with hearing students. Gifted students also often have similar issues with the idea of least restrictive environment. The regular classroom for many gifted students is not the least restrictive environment. It places restrictions on their education because they are tied to the performance and achievement of other students. So there are different models that schools that provide gifted services offer. One are direct services. And these are, typically gifted only classes. These are classes that only gifted students enroll in. Ideally, in my opinion, these are content classes. So gifted English, gifted math, gifted science, gifted social studies. Sometimes they are instead enrichment classes. If they are enrichment classes, they should replace other learning. I had a friend whose children were gifted and was very frustrated in elementary school because they would go to their enrichment class and they would be given homework by their gifted teacher, which was appropriate for that class and for those students. But then they would go back to their regular classes and the teacher there would make them do all the homework for that class as well. A gifted student should not be given more work. A gifted student should not be given more work than their peers. They should be given different work. Not more work, different work. Not more work, different work. Now, another type of service that's provided is a consultation service, and this is where the person who is identified as the gifted teacher may do various things. They may meet with the student one-on-one, but kind of just briefly, not necessarily for instructional purposes, but just to check up on the student, see how classes are going, and then support teachers as needed to help the teacher meet the student's needs. These services are sometimes used for kids whose needs are less severe, and they're also sometimes used in larger, when one person is responsible for the gifted services of lots and lots of students, as might occur. So curriculum compaction works really well. The Susan Weinbrenner book that I've recommended for this class talks about curriculum compaction. It's where I think I first learned about it, in fact. And the idea here is for you as the teacher to think about in your curriculum, look at your standards, look at your indicators or benchmarks. What are the most important things learners need from your curriculum? Allow your gifted students to master that, to show you that they know it, and use the rest of their class time to work on other projects. It's as simple and as challenging as that. And so if you know that your kids at the end of the year are going to be tested on fractions, decimals, and percents, that seems a typical math thing to be tested on in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade maybe. And that's your unit for the next 3 weeks. Let your gifted kids, let all your kids if you want, but at least let your gifted math kids do a pre-test on that unit. And if they show that they know it, have them use their time on something else. If they know it all except for 1 or 2 things, let them work on just those 1 or 2 things and then use their time on something else. Now, people always ask, well, that's not fair for other students. And I have 2 answers to that. Answer 1 is equity isn't treating everybody the same. You could say the same thing of, well, it's not fair to the other students that my kid with a learning disability gets time and a half on their test. But they do, because that is the equitable thing to do. But the good news is you can give that same privilege to everyone. Pre-test everyone and tell them, if you get 100% on the pretest, or maybe you get a 95% on the pretest, then you can do an in-depth project of your choice. And lots of kids who aren't gifted may first try that. I think that's really good. And then they might realize either A, I have no clue what the test is about, B, I don't want to do an in-depth project. That sounds like a lot of work. And they're going to go about their business. So I don't think there's anything wrong with giving this option to all of your students. It may also be that your gifted kids don't want to do it, because some gifted kids are lazy, and that becomes a problem because we need to get them to be less lazy for reasons we'll talk about later. But certainly, by all means, give this option to everyone. You may, by doing it, find a kid who is gifted that you didn't realize was gifted. And then acceleration. All research supports acceleration. When there have been studies done, what are called meta-studies, where studies studies about studies, where you looked at all the research and you looked at how effective different teaching techniques were for gifted learners, acceleration is at the top of the list. All research supports acceleration. When won't it work? It won't work if there isn't support. So if the kid doesn't want to be accelerated, then it won't work. If the parents don't want it, then it won't work. People always say, oh, they are going to be isolated from their peers. Your truly gifted kids are often already isolated from their peers in your class. And you will see that once you see them in the class. There are no harmful social effects from acceleration, as long as the kid wants it. And then the other concern that comes up, and I hear this a lot from math teachers, and I taught math, so I can complain about math teachers, is that they say, oh, math builds on itself. They're going to have gaps. There's going to be gaps in their learning. Gaps, 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 gaps. To which I say, possibly, but there's good news. They're gifted. They learn fast and forever. So if there is a gap, they can be retaught that gap or taught that gap really quickly, and they will get it. So any academic gaps that exist are very quickly overcome for someone who is truly gifted. Acceleration works, period. If someone tells you it doesn't work, that person is incorrect, period. There are many things in my classes where I will say, you do not have to agree with me. I am not here to brainwash you. You have to agree with me here because the research agrees with me. Acceleration works. Again, if a child doesn't want to be accelerated, you're right, then it won't work. If a parent doesn't want it, then it won't work. But as long as parents and students want it, the research supports it. So let's talk about some issues and questions with gifted. Classroom struggles. We're going to talk about underachievement and motivation. Very common in districts where gifted is a thing and where children are identified is to hear teachers say, "Oh, I can't believe this child is gifted. They are failing my class." Underachievement is a very real thing. We mentioned before that half of gifted students don't match ability and achievement. Why do they underachieve? I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer here. If I did, I would be writing books. There are books about underachievement, but they don't really solve much of anything, in my experience. I haven't read them all. What causes underachievement? Well, one thing is peers. 66% of students reported that peers are a primary force against good grades. That sometimes is especially true for children who are from groups that are underrepresented in gifted programs. And so if your gifted program is 90% white, your students who aren't white are probably going to say that their peers are a primary force against good grades. If your gifted program is 80% female students, your male students are probably going to say that their peers are a reason why they aren't getting good grades. Some of your students, actually, not all, but some. These are real issues, cultural issues in all sorts of cultures. So peers are definitely one issue. Other issues are these, and some of these are under your control. One, classrooms that are inflexible. When you say everyone does the same thing the same way every day, and sometimes that is not on you as the teacher, the school says it. If a school says it, they aren't interested in what's best for kids. If you are teaching a lockstep curriculum, if your school tells you everyone is going to do the same math lesson the same way this day, everyone's doing the same reading lesson, everyone's doing the same whatever lesson, that school will not be a good school for gifted learners. They will underachieve. I would almost bet money on it. Classrooms that are overly competitive can also cause underachievement. Now, competition in schools is really tricky. For a long time, classrooms tended to be way too competitive. And that is something that I think has really changed in the past 30, 40 years. And some argue it's gone too far. There's been some research. I don't know how good the research is, but there's been some that argues that male underachievement in school, regardless of whether they're gifted or not, that boys underachieve because classrooms are not competitive enough. And so be aware that it's possible to be too competitive, but it may be possible to not be competitive enough for some students. Sometimes remediation may worsen things because that may cause the child to label themselves stupid. Your gifted kids don't know they're gifted necessarily. And so that child who has been bored since first grade and has stopped trying is going to fall behind in some cases because they've stopped studying. And when you get them as a 7th grader, they aren't at grade level anymore. And so your school puts them in tier 2 remediation. And that may actually, for a gifted kid, actually worsen underachievement because they think that they're stupid. A very controversial one is cooperative learning. Cooperative learning, when it's mixed ability, when it's heterogeneous mixed ability groups, is not usually appropriate for gifted learners. The initial research on cooperative learning done by Johnson & Johnson at the University of Minnesota, if I remember correctly, systematically excluded the bottom and the top 5 to 10% of students. In other words, the seminal research that tells us, oh, cooperative learning works, didn't include gifted learners. And research since then about cooperative learning has been at best mixed. So For cooperative learning, if you're doing class building or team building activities, that's fine. If you are doing academics in your cooperative learning groups, which is what we normally use them for, that is usually not appropriate for a gifted kid unless they're with other gifted kids. Sometimes not even that. And why isn't it appropriate? It's for a couple of reasons. One is it forces them into a teacher's role. And for a kid who's just above average or high average, that can be really good because they aren't that far above their peers. But a gifted kid can be 4 or 5 years above their peers. And that can cause it to be really hard for them to try to explain something to them. They get frustrated when they try to explain something. And it does lead to this feeling of superiority. It does not benefit the social, emotional setting of the classroom. It also, in other cases, can encourage conformity in a group. And so, and I may have said earlier homogeneous groups. I meant to say heterogeneous groups. In other words, mixed ability groups. And in one of those groups, the gifted kids sometimes will pretend that they aren't gifted because they don't want it to appear that they're showing off to their group mates. Other causes of underachievement, goals may be set too high or too low. That can be true by the teacher. It can be true if it's a parent goal. It can even be true if it's a child's own goal, if they don't know how to set goals appropriate, and an unrewarding curriculum. If a child isn't challenged by a curriculum, they will find stimulation outside of it, including in ways that might get them labeled ADHD or have an emotional behavior disorder. How can we motivate? One thing we can do is we can give students choice. We can give students a choice in what they learn, in how they learn it, and how they show their learning. We can do curriculum compaction by shortening assignments. If you're giving 20 homework questions for something, pick the 5 hardest ones and tell your gifted students. And again, you can tell all your students, do these 5 first. If you get them all right, you don't have to do the homework. And if your gifted students do, awesome. They don't have to do the homework. If your non-gifted students get them all right, that means that homework assignment wasn't very challenging for them either. They don't have to do it either. Respect the learning your kids come in with. If you have that kindergartner who reads, don't teach them how to read. Ensure that they're still learning. Provide real challenge to your students. And I don't know where this quote comes from anymore. I should have cited it and I didn't when I made this. But we know that insufficient challenge for students is most likely to occur when teachers use a one-size-fits-all curriculum. And those are curricula that are increasingly common in schools because schools don't respect teachers. We want to make sure that we are meeting our children's zones of proximal development. We want material that's difficult enough to stretch their minds, but not so difficult as to frustrate. I like giving my little stick person here, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And the idea here is that ideal learning is learning that is just out of reach of the student. It is the learning that they can reach with scaffolding. So here's my ladder, that's scaffolding. And so with the scaffolding provided by a teacher, sometimes with the scaffolding provided by another student, sometimes it might be scaffolding provided by a book or by a computer or a program or an app of some sort, the student can reach this learning. Learning that the student can reach entirely on their own doesn't challenge the student, and learning they can't reach even with assistance is too hard. So most of your kids, that 68% or so, that's right around average, is going to have one general zone of proximal development. Your kids who are gifted need more challenge. Your kids who have various types of disabilities need more support and less challenge. And I mentioned before, enrichment should not be just work added on. It should be things replaced. Oftentimes, those modifications made for gifted are appropriate for high achievers, some of who are unlabeled gifted for a variety of reasons. I mentioned that some parents want their kids to be gifted because it's a status symbol. There's also some parents who mistakenly, in my opinion, refuse to have their child labeled gifted because they think it is elitist. It is not. They are wrong. But we can still meet those needs using these modifications regardless of whether or not there's a label. In our final video, we will talk about differentiation and a few closing thoughts on advocacy and why gifted's important, and secondary students in particular.